Hello, I'm Chai Hofilenia. Welcome to Talk Thursday. The Philippines' location along the Pacific Ocean's Ring of Fire makes the country a hotspot for earthquakes and other geological hazards. In July 1990, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake hit the island of Luzon. About 2,400 people died as the cities of Baguio, Cabanatuan, and Dagupan were the hardest hit. More recently, in October 2013, another strong earthquake with a magnitude of 7.2 hit Central Visayas, destroying historical structures and leaving at least 222 dead. Experts say Metro Manila is due for a big one. A 2004 study by the Japan International Cooperation Agency says an earthquake hitting Metro Manila could destroy 40% of buildings and could kill about 34,000 people. To prepare for such a situation, the city government of Manila organized an earthquake drill on July 2. But are these preparations enough? Joining us this afternoon is FIVOX Director Dr. Renato Solidum to discuss scenarios and what's needed to better prepare for another major earthquake. Good afternoon, Dr. Solidum.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming over and joining us for this important discussion. I'd like to ask you about the Manila drill, which was the earthquake drill, which was held very recently. How important is that drill and why was it conducted?
Well, this is very important because people need to know exactly what they're supposed to do during the earthquake and after it. Because sometimes people would just run away, get out of the building, but they might be affected unnecessarily. Because as they get out, things might fall, the glass panels might fall, and it would have been better if they just stayed inside, and if the building will not collapse, they will not be affected. But the other important thing that must be done, aside from the actual drill, would be to check whether the houses and buildings that people stay are really structurally sound and would not really collapse during an earthquake. Earthquake drills have this premise that the building is structurally sound. Things might fall down, things might topple down, so people need to get protected by hiding either beneath a sturdy table or protecting their heads and necks with their arms by going to the safer spots inside the room, inside buildings.
But the premise there is that the building is
structurally sound.
Yes.
It will not pancake or collapse.
Yeah.
It will not really topple down. Because if the buildings or houses will topple down, then their chance of survival, of course, will be lowered.
The drill, I think, was premised on a 7.2 magnitude quake. What exactly does that feel like? What happens when you have a 7.2 earthquake?
The 7.2 is an example of the magnitude of an earthquake. Magnitude is essentially the energy of the earthquake as released from below the ground. If the earthquake is very shallow, for example 5 kilometers deep, then that energy released from below will not be diminished as much by the rocks that it passes through because the thickness is not so much. If the magnitude 7.2 is way below at 100 kilometers deep, then a very thick layer of rock must be passed through by the earthquake wave before it reaches the surface. So a lot of the energy would have been absorbed by the rocks themselves. So to describe the scenario for Metro Manila, based on the length of the West Valley Fault, which is the longer fault of the Valley Fault system that would actually traverse the eastern side of Metro Manila, if that earthquake is sourced 5 kilometers below the surface, then the effect on the surface, which we now call the intensity, will be intensity 8. Intensity 8 can be described as a motion where you have difficulty standing. If you're on the first floor, you have difficulty standing. How much more if you're on the upper floor of tall buildings? The higher the floor, the more sway the buildings will behave. So therefore, it will be very difficult for a person to stand during an intensity 8 earthquake.
Assuming it's intensity 8 and you're on a high-rise building, what do you do? Do you go to the higher floors or do you run down to the basement or to the first level?
During the earthquake itself, you don't go up, you don't go down. What you do is, inside the room where you are, when the earthquake happened, you have to go to the safest part of the room. Typically, if there is a beam and post, that is the best part of the building, it's the structural stronghold of the building, then you go there. If there is glass, however, on the corner of the building, that would be dangerous. So hopefully tall buildings will have tempered glasses. They should also, if there is a sturdy table, they should hide beneath the sturdy table, get under, and they should hold the leg of the table, a leg of the table, because the floor will be moving, the table will also be moving. And if you don't hold it, it will separate from you and you lose the protective wooden structure if things would fall from the ceiling.
What insights did you get from the exercise, from the Manila drill? Were you able to identify certain loopholes or gaps which local governments should probably address?
Well, essentially, for every drill that families and communities would do, they're just responding to the actual shaking scenario. But what happens after it, whether there will be damages to the buildings, whether there will be collision of vehicles on the road, whether there will be fire, of course, would need to be addressed by different groups. I think what we sometimes see during actual drills would be some people would not take it seriously.
Yes, they take selfies.
Yes. Well, maybe it's their first drill, but in reality that can happen if people are not made aware of the importance of the drill. Before the actual drill should happen, there must be an awareness campaign for the residents of buildings and people in the community. They should be told of the actual scenario, what to expect if there is an earthquake coming from this fault or coming from that particular fault. And they're supposed to also know the dangers of earthquakes, the different dangers. Unlike fire, earthquakes would pose multiple dangers. Aside from the strong shaking, it can cause the collapse of building. Fire can happen. If the earthquake is sourced offshore, there can be a tsunami after. If the ground is soft, there can be liquefaction where you can see roads being fissured or water gushing out of the ground with sand, like a fountain of water and sand. Or if your house is on a steep slope, then there can be landslide. So preparing for an earthquake need a better understanding of the different earthquake hazards and the different responses to the different hazards. If we don't do a proper information campaign before the drill, then some people might not take it seriously. That's why it's very important at the village level for the village officials to really pioneer it and lead it, for companies or organizations or offices in tall buildings, for every offices, the officials or the human resource personnel in charge of the staff would be the one explaining to the staff.
Did Manila do it properly?
I think so. They've been announcing this, but you expect that in some groups they might not take it seriously because they think it's fun.
There's a quick question here from social media. This is from Kokoy Dayao. Please ask which parts of Manila is vulnerable or are vulnerable to a magnitude 7 earthquake, and what is being done or can be done to minimize property damage and loss of life.
Okay. This is a very good question. All people are fault finders, figuratively. But among geologists, there are certain geologists that try to look for active faults where it is located exactly on the ground, and that's our job. For some people though, or maybe for many people, they think that if a house is not on top of an active fault, then they're safe.
Yeah.
The reason why we identify where the active fault is first for houses and buildings not to be built on top of it. Because if the fault would move associated with a strong earthquake or large magnitude earthquake, the ground can be ruptured, we call it a ground rupture hazard, and the house or building on top of it can also be displaced.
Right.
So therefore, placing a house or a building directly on top of an active fault is really dangerous. And we recommend a buffer zone of at least 5 meters away. However, the most important hazard is not the rupture, because the ground shaking itself, which is the actual definition of an earthquake, will affect areas even farther away from the fault. For example, in 1968, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake originated from Casiguran, Aurora. That's more than 200 kilometers away northeast of Manila. Despite that distance, the Binondo Ruby Tower collapsed, killing 268 people. Therefore, that is a very good example to tell people that despite the distance of your community from a particular fault that will move if a house or building is not built properly. It is weak for such and such ground shaking, then people's lives are in danger. So the whole Metro Manila, actually, if a magnitude 7.2 earthquake would be sourced from the West Valley Fault, then the whole of Metro Manila can be affected by an intensity 8 ground shaking. Likewise, towns nearby Metro Manila, like those of Bulacan, Western Rizal, parts of Cavite and Laguna, will also be affected by intensity 8 earthquake. Further out, north and south and east, the earthquake shaking will be intensity 7. If we compare intensity 7 and 8, we call intensity 8 as a very destructive earthquake, where we can expect damages to weak or poorly designed buildings. Intensity 8 shaking is typical of what happened during the 1990 earthquake, where buildings collapsed in Cabanatuan, Baguio, and even Pangasinan. Even in the Bohol earthquake last year, towns near the epicenter were affected by an intensity 8 earthquake. If the West Valley Fault would move, and if we are here in Metro Manila, the first motion that people would feel if the earthquake is really strong would be up and down motion. In a few seconds, it will be horizontal and long.
Okay.
However,
which is more dangerous? Is it the up and down motion or the horizontal motion?
these are equally dangerous, but the horizontal movement is longer. So that's why buildings are designed to really withstand the horizontal shaking, because it would last long. The longer the shaking, the more dangerous it is. However, there will be earthquakes that will be sourced from other faults outside of Metro Manila. We can still feel it, like during the 1990 earthquake. However, during that earthquake, people in Metro Manila felt it in a horizontal manner because the epicenter is already far. That is why, if there is an earthquake, if possible, people should pay particular attention to the motion that they feel, whether it's vertical first and then horizontal. That is the case, then the fault has moved. If the motion is only horizontal, better news. Not really good news, but at least it's not that fault.
It's less.
Yes.
It's less
dangerous. Because we will obviously have aftershocks, which are strong if the valley fault has moved already.
So you're saying that irrespective whether it's horizontal or vertical, you stay put.
Yes. Now, the reason why we stay put is that people get killed if things fall on them. People get killed if they run outside using stairs, and imagine during the shaking, the steps will actually move. And the landing of your feet will not be exactly there, so you might fall down.
Yes.
So during the strong shaking, drop, cover, and hold, stop, get out of the building if it's really strong by going down and not by going up, because you won't have anything to do up there. You still have to go down because aftershocks might follow, and even if the building has not been damaged significantly during the main shock, aftershocks can cause it to fall down.
There was a study conducted by or done in cooperation with JICA, and this is the mayor study.
By FIVOX and MMDA.
Right. I think the premise there is, or the scenario is that Metro Manila will be cut off from. There would be no communication, and people would have to secure or try to help Metro Manila. How ready are we for that scenario? Have you had drills conducted with other cities or even other countries?
Yes. Okay. But before I answer that, let me just clarify that immediately after the earthquake, you need to think of the effects of the earthquake to Metro Manila, not only in terms of building damage, but also fire, impact to bridges, impact to transport systems, and impact to the actual roads themselves, the ground. I mentioned rupture of the ground because of faulting. I mentioned the strong shaking. But during the strong shaking itself, those grounds that are underlain by sand with a lot of water, and these are typically the areas that are flooded, these are what we call liquefaction prone. The ground behaves like a liquid during the strong shaking, and essentially the ground will move differentially. There can be fissuring, and so you don't expect roads to be passable right away.
Okay.
There can also be fire. So given the different types of foundation or lithologies or rocks all over Metro Manila, there will be differences in behavior, differences in damage, and even bridges. So essentially, if we think of Metro Manila as subdivided by the west flowing Pasig River from the east if bridges crossing Pasig River is not possible, then those from Makati will not be able to move to Quezon City. The western side of Metro Manila, the coastal cities of Metro Manila, are underlain by soft sediment. And there are also many half wood, half concrete or wooden structures there, and so fire can also spread. And even bridges might be affected. So those parts can be somewhat isolated.
Yes.
And even bridges crossing Marikina River might be affected. So given that situation, people should not expect that immediate help will come to them right away. And so therefore, it is a must for communities to have their own capacity to respond to their own neighboring communities or to their neighbors in their own community, so that they can at least respond to the effects right away, like simply doing the first aid, or professional medical officers can respond to their own community. Metro Manila Development Authority has been training volunteers for search and rescue. But the impact can actually be big. So those at the higher level of position in our society, like those in government, would be able to now direct which organization should help which community. So starting in 2005, after the result of the Metro Manila Earthquake Impact Reduction Study was released, the Philippines has been coordinating with the Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs of the UN,
Yes.
where they have this international search and rescue group. So we've been doing exercises with them where foreign search and rescue groups would come in.
How often do you do this?
Well, maybe every 2 years. Depends. The civil military drills are almost done every year.
Okay.
But sometimes it's for typhoon, sometimes it's for earthquake. But it's a regular thing. And essentially, we try to facilitate the arrival and entry of the foreign search and rescue groups immediately, so that they can respond to us. Now, of course, we have responders from other provinces
Right.
flocking into Metro Manila, and it's important for the local and international responders to have an understanding of what they're doing.
Yeah.
They might not speak the same language, but they practice the international symbols, like for example, marking buildings that were inspected and should not be entered into. So they practice that.
So there's a definite protocol that you've agreed on.
Yes, but
whenever these
yes.
things happen,
But-
people know what to do.
Yes, but definitely we need to do more of this by building more search and rescue groups all over the Philippines. And if I am the official of a city, you might think that you're building the search and rescue group for them to be used in your own disaster if it happens in the future. But you should also think that this can help other cities. You know, Filipinos are known for their bayanihan spirit, supposedly. So we need to practice that by making sure that if Metro Manila, for example, is preparing for the earthquake, preparing Metro Manila for an earthquake would also mean preparing communities, provinces or cities outside of Manila to be prepared to respond to Metro Manila, or vice versa,
Yes.
if the earthquake would happen in their own communities.
There's another question here. As far as preparedness is concerned, what lessons were learned from the Bohol earthquake?
Okay. There are several lessons. First, let's just state first that the shaking itself do not kill people.
Okay.
The shaking will lead to potential collapse of buildings. Collapse of buildings kill people.
Okay.
Second, the strong ground shaking can cause steep slopes to collapse through landslides. And landslides can bury people alive. So, in terms of preparing for an earthquake, if we focus on the ground shaking itself and causing the collapse of building and causing landslide, we can say two things at least. First, we need to make sure that houses and buildings are constructed properly. We have a very good building code. Implementation is an issue. But implementation connotes many things. First, are people really submitting their design correctly? And if approved, are they really following the design so that during the construction phase, these follow the code, the guidance of the code? We need to implement the code. Second, are they using appropriate or standard materials? There have been talks of substandard materials, both concrete hollow block and iron, being sold. And so, making the buildings resilient to an earthquake means having a good design, using good materials or standard materials, and having good workmanship. The second is, in areas with steep slopes and really at high vulnerability to landslide, then we must follow an appropriate land use. We should restrict people, we should forbid people to build on those steep slopes or immediately below those steep slopes because they will be buried by landslide. Third lesson is we need a lot of responders so that they can help people right away. There's a golden rule that it is important for people to be rescued during the first 3 days. And that is why we always tell people that if you want to prepare for an earthquake, you have to have per family an emergency bag.
Okay.
An emergency bag.
What should go into the emergency bag?
Of course, water is very important. Ready to eat food. Extra clothes if you want. If of course if you need to evacuate the house if it collapsed.
Yeah.
Flashlight. First aid. Medicine. Battery operated radio. Why? Because there will be no electricity.
Okay.
If you want matches, you can also do that. Flashlight, whistle. It's important to have whistle.
So you should have a whistleblower per family.
Yeah. Because if you're trapped,
Yeah.
well, you cannot just shout. You might lose your voice, right? There are many other for those who have ailment, then they need to put medicine. Ropes if they want. Sometimes important documents, a copy of their important documents. These emergency bags are not only for earthquake but for the other hazards.
A lot of experts say, I remember we had an Australian guest, I think earlier this year or it was last year, and he said that Metro Manila is a laboratory, actually the Philippines is a laboratory for disaster. It's like the experts come here because everything that could go wrong could happen here, and you just have to anticipate and prepare. Given that perspective, I mean the things that you were saying a while ago, that the building code should be followed, there should be no houses erected near slopes, but as we have observed, these aren't really implemented.
Well, these are implemented, but not for all. Okay. Case in point is that some houses are built without asking for a permit, and the house owners themselves would just build it with no guidance from licensed engineer or architect. Now, FIVOX DOST, my office, has released a 12-point questionnaire, and this was actually placed in your website.
Okay.
Where people can actually answer every question with a score of 1 or 0, and after the survey, you can sum up all your answers. And if you have a perfect score, that would mean that your house, either 1 or 2-story concrete house, is okay for an earthquake. But if the score is like below 8, then it's really dangerous. It can be affected heavily by an earthquake. And we tested this in Bohol.
Yeah.
And making sure that people are aware of the consequence is important. Now, when it comes to following laws, people would always look up to the government or to the local government for implementation. But my point is, it's not only the local government or building official or land use planner that would really determine if a house is built with proper guidance following the building code, or if they follow the land use plan. The house owners themselves are responsible, and that is governance. However, people might not be aware of the consequence of what they're doing. So we really have to have a massive information campaign, and we are introducing the concept of disaster imagination.
What is that?
What is disaster imagination? Let's go to Yolanda. Would it be better if we have anticipated the consequence of Yolanda and how it can affect the individual person, family, the locality or the province or even the whole country? The hazards are there. We have anticipated the hazard, but the consequence were not that appreciated by people. That is why they did not evacuate properly, or maybe they didn't know that they need to evacuate. They were responding to the strong wind. So disaster imagination is really appreciating the hazard that can happen not only in their own locality but beyond their locality, because the disaster can be massive and they cannot just move from one place to another. Second is anticipating the consequence, the impact. Anticipating or implementing the right solution to make people safer, to save lives, to conduct mitigation measures, to protect properties. And even if we do that, we still need to anticipate the remaining problem that might be a result of that large-scale disaster like an earthquake to critical facilities like lifeline, water, power, electricity, communication, bridges, seaports, airports. If we are able to do that, then we can anticipate the needed equipment, the needed human resource to respond to making sure that critical facilities are able to get back as soon as possible to provide the critical services to the people. And we have a term for that. We call that recovery time objective.
Okay.
For example, if you're here in Rappler and if you were affected initially by a strong earthquake, then at some point you wanted to report what is happening.
Yeah.
You need to set that time so that you have that target. If you don't have a set target, you will only do your service when you are able. In essence, if we don't have a deadline to recover as soon as possible, not 100%, but the critical core business or service of a local community, then the response will be slow. Essentially, disaster imagination is anticipating the problem and the solution. Just like a human sickness, a human disease.
Yeah.
We cannot prescribe the proper medication if we don't know the proper diagnosis.
Which of the LGUs in Metro Manila would be most prepared, do you think?
Well, I know that Makati is preparing for an earthquake. They have been doing this, and they're into actually looking at the feasibility of redeveloping villages that are transected by the West Valley Fault. And Pasig is also doing that. Marikina is doing that in Quezon City. In fact, maybe starting in 2011, many of these cities have asked for our geologists to walk the fault with them, identifying on the ground where the active fault is. Muntinlupa is also doing that. But the next thing that they must do, though, is really inspecting all houses and buildings, whether these are built properly, or even if these were built properly with the new code or National Structural Code, which serves as the supplemental code to our building code. These buildings are really up to par to the most recent code.
But I think the difficulty with that, especially for Metro Manila, is it's difficult to move people out. Like they've invested in houses, they've built in areas where LGUs or local governments had allowed them to build, and then ask them to move because of
Not
of the
really. You don't
dangers?
need to move. Okay, as mentioned, the first thing that people look at is where the fault would traverse.
Yeah.
The fault is not so wide. It's actually very narrow. Sometimes less than 1 foot. So you just need to have a buffer zone of at least 5 meters on both sides of the active fault trace. So imagine the number is not so many. Now, of course, you must make people aware that if they're on top of the fault, then they will experience the strongest ground shaking. At least they know that they're on top and they will experience the strongest ground shaking. So they need to respond to it as fast as possible, better, more appropriate. The more important hazard, though, is the ground shaking that can cause collapse of building. You don't need people to move away, but making sure to identify the weak buildings and retrofit it or strengthen it. Or condemn those that cannot be fixed. It might be very expensive to fix, so just build another one. And cities to have financial breaks or tax breaks to help people rebuild weak buildings. You just cannot tell people you rebuild your house and then you don't help them.
Okay, this is a very interesting discussion on earthquakes and not very comforting though. But maybe just a last question. If you were to address a family, what do you tell them? How can they best be prepared for a strong earthquake?
First thing is evaluate the hazards that they might suffer if there's an earthquake. whether they're tap on of active fault or not. Ground shaking is the most serious hazard. And so, evaluate if their house was built properly. If not, then consult. If doctors have this medical mission to help poor people with sicknesses, I wanted to advocate for our professional engineers and architects to conduct their own mission, not for sick people but for sick houses, and to help them evaluate. And then they can make certain
By the way,
things.
do you have a database of these experts so that maybe people can, it would be easy
Well,
to
there are
communicate with them?
associations. The Philippine Institute of Civil Engineers, the Association of Structural Engineers of the Philippines, there are many architect associations.
Okay.
And I think the building officials within the cities can actually help and pool this or network with these professional societies. They can strengthen their houses by making sure that things that might topple or fall down are anchored properly. They need to identify the safer spots in their houses and the dangerous spots, like avoid glasses,
Yes.
avoid things that might fall down or topple down. And they need to identify evacuation areas within their own community. Open areas where at least the distance is 1.5 times the height of the nearest structure to the open area. And they do a drill in their own houses, in their own community, not only in schools and offices. I think DepEd can also influence how communities are prepared. Usually there are assignments to students.
Yeah.
Madami nga, madalas, almost every week. Why not make a special assignment in one class where you ask the student, together with his or her family, prepare an earthquake evacuation plan outlining the
Where to
house,
go.
the first floor, second floor, or third floor,
Yeah.
where to stay during an earthquake, and where to go by identifying an open area in the community and the routes that they should take. And submit this to the teacher to check if this was properly made.
And that means also coordination within the barangay.
And coordination within the barangay. That would make earthquake preparedness much wider, rather than just simply focusing on the student's ability to properly respond to an earthquake in school. Let's also focus on what they're supposed to do at home.
Okay. Thank you very much. We've been talking to Dr. Renato Solidum of FIVOX about the possibility of a major earthquake hitting Metro Manila and what ought to be done to prepare for it. I'm Chai Hofilenia. Thank you for joining us.